Hi guys, welcome back. Today's case is one that had me on the edge of my seat when I was researching it, because there is nothing more frustrating, I find, than discovering serial killers, multiple murderers, human predators who have been walking the streets for decades free, all the while believing there's some invincibility about their actions, because with every passing year, their confidence from the crimes that they've done in the past must grow, believing that they've outsmarted the authorities. And this case is absolutely going to exemplify just that. Imagine being Anthony Shaw, walking around with the knowledge in the back of your mind of the heinous killings, children killings that you've been responsible for, and yet no one has come for you. Hanging out with your friends, being around your family, being seen by some people as a good person. And yet behind that mask is a human predator of the highest level. It's really compelling, this story, because like I said, it really makes you think about the streets that you walk on a daily basis and whether you truly ever know the people in your local area. It's why I wrote my book, The Serial Killer Next Door. Because the truth is, do you ever really know the people who are living around you? Sometimes, do you ever really know the people that you're living intimately with? Let's talk about all that today. Before I kick off though, I want to say thank you to all of you supporting me on YouTube membership and Patreon. You get lots of extra content there. I hope you're enjoying all those full-length videos. Believe me, I have plans. There are going to be lots and lots more there, but without you, I can't do this. If you are returning to my channel again and again and you haven't subscribed, please do. It really helps me. Also, if you like my content, give it a like. It helps me with the algorithm. Get your notifications on. You will never miss an episode. As you know, I sell lots of merch that's created here. So if you do want any of my special crime merch, then you can follow the link in the description below. Enough of all that though. Let's talk about Anthony Shaw. So Anthony Shaw was born in 1962 on June the 25th. He was born in South Dakota. He had two young sisters. One was called Laurel and the other one is called Gina. Very typical women, by the way. So we're talking about how sometimes a family can be created, imperfect, by the way, but nonetheless create children who are all so very, very different. Now, his parents, they were called Robert and Deanna Shaw. Both of them were in the military. Now, one of the things about being a family who are in the military is, aside from those individuals who are obviously willing to sacrifice their lives to protect us, there are other sacrifices that occur as well. I actually have a lot of friends who went into the military. My school had a boys' school, and that boys' school was very forces orientated. So a lot went in the RAF, a lot went in the Marines, a lot in the Navy, and so on and so forth. And it's meant that most of my friends from school are all over the world, because that's one of the sacrifices. If you go into the military, you are beholden to where you're posted. So that means that if you have children, there is a transience level at times to their experience, or an absence at times to their parents. But in this case, Shaw's family was actually required to move around a lot. So to give you an example of how that played out for Anthony Shaw, before he even started high school, the family had moved 9 times. When I think about my childhood, I moved once. Then after leaving home, carried on my happy way, but just once during my entire life. So stability, foundation, peer opportunity, all of those things much more easy for somebody like myself than somebody like Anthony Shaw. So you can say you would have a very disrupted childhood. You're never settling in one area for very long, and there is a big problem there. First of all, what we see psychologically is when a child starts a new school, for about 10 seconds, they're interesting, because kids have got these alliances and allegiances with their friends, sometimes very long-standing in the schools. And when this new kid arrives, obviously they're shiny and bright and new for a very short period of time. And then often it tempers and those groups return to their original groups, and the child often feels very, very isolated. And that can be a repetitive experience. Not always, some kids get lucky. But when you have that repetitive experience, it's a repetitive abandonment. And that makes the world feel unsafe. And also, it can lead to quite a deep rage, because everybody wants to feel like they belong, and it can feel grossly unfair when you don't believe you do. Now, his sister, Gina, she said, when I think about my brother as a child, even as a child, he was really charismatic, he was super confident, and also he had a true gift. He was incredibly talented at art, he was a skilled musician. But she said with that incredible talent, with that incredible gift, there was just this absolute depth of arrogance And also there were some odd traits that she felt he exhibited as a child. So he was extremely neat and tidy. He'd even used to hang his socks on hangers. And I suppose from the outside looking in, people could say, well, that sounds like he could be on the OCD spectrum, that everything has to have its order. But I would say, just from a slightly less rigid approach to that psychological analysis, that if you're a child with little control in your life, if you're moving around constantly, if you fear that people are looking at you as a stranger and you're trying to fit in, then sometimes creating order in your life and making things seem as if you are in control of them can make you feel at least you have a level of control over that situation, so that hopefully no one will look from the outside in and judge you harshly for failing in certain areas that you indeed can have some power over. And that could definitely be one of the reasons why he acts in this way. And even though for most of us we're thinking, hangs his socks on hangers? My children still use the floor, and one of them's 22. This is something, actually, I'm just going to apologise in advance. My 22-year-old doesn't do that. He's very neat and tidy. His 19-year-old brother, however, the floor is his wardrobe. He's away at the moment. He fights in Thailand, and he's going to come back to pretty much an empty wardrobe because Mum went mad and threw everything out, because I don't believe that it's required to keep things that he had in that wardrobe. And I believe good new starts are a very, very effective way for a new year. So all you mums out there and dads out there doing the same, I got your back. But we can see this is quite an unusual way of acting in childhood. And it extends, as far as he is concerned, to everyone else. He wants everyone else to live in the same way. So his sisters were constantly being told by Shaw how to behave, how to act, and he would literally try to teach them, which you can imagine where siblings are concerned. They're like, really? I would just like to go outside and have a game of free whip. I do not want you to show me how to hang my socks up. So again, we're noticing a desire for control. It seems quite amusing when you imagine that he's getting his siblings in line and saying you should do A, B, and C, but with respect, it means that there is a disconnect there. Also, I suppose people could say, well, this is a military family, Emma, and military families often have regimented and ordered ways because their behaviour has to be so, because they have to act in accordance with the sets of rules and regulations that the authorities over them actually expect of them. And that could indeed trickle down as well. So he could just be ingesting that regimentation. Another thing that is deeply problematic in his childhood, and again is highly atypical, is he's really violent. For those of you lovers of animals, and I know that most of you, if not all of you who come to my channel, absolutely are, it's not very nice to hear that somebody stabs a kitten to death. And that's exactly what he did when he was around 5 years old. Now, I have worked with animal killers, and I have always found that a really big problem because of my own feelings and leanings into regarding my relationship with animals, but more because of the predictor. It's a really bad predictor of future violent behaviour. And I have worked with young people who have been 10, 11, 12, adolescents with respect mainly, and very few in my 20 years of working with them. However, 5 years of age is pretty terrifying. Now, some will counter what I've just said and say, he was 5 years old, Emma. There is a very big distinction between 5 and 15, because at 5 years old, you certainly do not know about life and death in the context you will at 15. At 5 years old, good and bad is not necessarily understood in the same context. At 5 years old, good attention, bad attention is kind of interpreted the same. Of course, we can also argue that. But I guarantee, if any of you had a 5-year-old and they literally brutalised a kitten by stabbing it to death, you would very likely take them straight to therapy. Because there is an intuition and an instinct within you that this is totally inappropriate. Also, on one occasion, he actually injures his sister's head with a screwdriver. So highly violent. And there's a real sexual overtone about his behaviour as a 5-year-old onwards. So he would try to kiss and grope girls from a young age. And he was really clever. He was manipulative. So he'd actually get his sisters as bait to lure girls to play with him. So he'd make his sister Gina knock on a door where he knew a particular girl lived. asked them to come out and play, which is what we did back in the day. I'm not sure it happens as much these days, but you know, when I was a kid, knock came on the door, somebody was waiting outside. If you were eating your tea, they just hung about until you were ready and off you went to play in the great outdoors. I imagine a lot of parents aren't quite as comfortable doing that anymore, but certainly that was my experience. And if I got a knock on the door from a girl, even if she was a stranger and she was like, you want to come and play ball? I would have been like, damn straight, let me out there. But he knew that, and he played and preyed on that by literally getting Gina to be bait. So then the minute those girls are out and the sister's meant to be playing with them, he just starts to harass them. Now, it won't surprise you with what I've just told you about this particular individual that he wasn't the most popular person at school. You know, when you go to school, having a history of stabbing kittens to death and attacking your sister with a screwdriver and just sexually harassing most of the local girls, it's one of those things that's going to cause a few issues when you arrive in the new environment. Now, his mother said he would get beaten up. I would say, what do you expect is going to happen to your son who you sent to a school who is literally a sexual predator and animal murderer? You will find that the average child, and we know there are children on a spectrum, some are super kind, some are super nasty, most of them are in the middle, but believe me, of all of that group, if you've killed a kitten or you're trying to sexually harass a girl, you're not going to end well, because all of those kids, no matter where they are on that spectrum, will likely have an issue with the morality reactions. And also, he had this really arrogant attitude. So he doesn't do anything to ingratiate himself to the other peers. And obviously you have to. Every child is looking for children who fit their paradigm of expectation. And if you're just aloof or rude, you're not going to get in with the group. You're not a safe person to be around. Now, the family end up settling in Texas. But at this point, there are problems in Robert and Deanna's marriage. In fact, it starts to break down by the time that Anthony is around 10 years of age. They were really arguing a lot. There was a lot of tension in the house. They both had affairs. So the children are definitely dealing with obvious disruption there. And also, the thing about parents who are playing away in their relationships is they don't have the time that they should for the children. I'm sure every single one of you, as I myself am aware, have been in relationships or had friends in relationships where affairs play out. And the person having the affair thinks they are being so secretive, they think they're being so capable of keeping it private, but really they're just constantly on their phone, or they're constantly going out, they lose weight, they suddenly seem a lot happier. All of these things give clues that something is amiss and awry in your relationship. And if there are children, they just don't have the time because their affections and their head has been turned elsewhere. And this has happened with both the parents. So you can imagine the kids are not getting a lot of attention. Now, in 1976, this leads to them divorcing. And the mother, in this case, gets the sole custody of 3 children. Very typical back in the 70s. These days it's 50-50 on the whole, and rightly so. But back in the 70s, certainly it was considered that a mother was best placed to bring up the kids. Now, when it comes to Anthony Shaw's mental state, obviously we've seen some atypical realities when he was growing up as a very young child. Think about the McDonald triad, animal torture, violence, etc. That's certainly one of the stalwarts of it, predicts future violent behaviour. And he actually talks to a psychiatrist when he's around 13 years of age. The very fact that he's talking to a psychiatrist as well evidences there's something going on. And at this point, he confides in that psychiatrist that his mother had sexually molested him. He also said that his father had been physically abusive to him and would actually beat him. Now, I can't validate whether that's absolutely true or whether that's a manipulation where Shaw is concerned. But if that happened to him, then that's another activator when we look at people who get involved in very serious crimes, and that's trauma. Now, in general, people who are traumatised go in an opposite direction. They're compassionate, they're loving, they go out of their way to help their fellow man and woman, and they are individuals who would be more likely to hurt themselves than anybody else. But if you are an individual with a predisposition for harm, and you are also someone who's experienced severe trauma, and you've had a lot of dysfunction, when we look at serial killers in the future and how they are activated, these are big activators, and he's certainly got many of those, even at a very early age. Now, in another example of just how violent this young Anthony Shaw is and how he's growing even more violent as he gets into his teen years, when he's around 16, he attacks and beats up a homeless man. Now, if you think about the scale of vulnerability, homeless individuals often have a plethora of issues compared to the average person living in a home. Many times they are vulnerable health-wise. Often they have additional issues like dependency. So they are not in a position to defend themselves. The fact that he selects somebody who he knows is going to be weaker than him, even if they're older and bigger than him, it speaks volumes, because it means that Anthony Shaw is starting to think in a very predatory way, a very manipulative way, and a very effective way when it comes down to getting away with crime and violence. Because very often, homeless people don't even tell the police when horrific things happen to them. I had the good grace and opportunity many years ago to do some work with the church. And part of the church's work, when I was training people to be mentors there, was to actually go out on the streets and to try to help people who were struggling. Yes, of course, it was about bringing them ideally into the church and helping them find faith and a new direction. Of course, it goes without saying, that wasn't my role. My role was to help them create mentors for people who could train and then go out and do the work that was essential to protect people. So I went out as part of my experience to understand what it's like. And I spoke to sex workers who genuinely were telling me they had been raped many, many times, and they had never gone to the police on the whole. In fact, one young woman I supported because of the fact that she'd been through such horrors, and actually I really encouraged her to end up going to court. And on the day she got to court, she just decided she couldn't go through with it because she was so terrified of being judged by people and so terrified of being made to be seen as somebody who had invited what had happened to her. So what we know is that people choose these victims for very good reason, because there are very few repercussions. Now, Shaw also at this point starts drinking and starts smoking pot. Now, 16 years of age, come on. Loads of us listening to what I'm saying now, including myself, will have smoked and drank at 16, will have taken recreational drugs at 16, but we will have been fine. Because for the most part, a typical brain, even though it's developing all the way up until 25 years of age, which means whatever we put into our body can impact on it, for the most part, we're pretty amazing. We heal incredibly. We can cope with the odd sling and arrow. At the end of the day, we are okay. But if you have these fractures in your foundation in that pen portrait of possibility, then you bet your bottom dollar it can exacerbate and amplify the fractures. And boy, this guy has got fractures. Now, at this point, I would say he's starting to really up the manipulation, and also the sexual predatory nature of him inherently is growing. So he starts offering girls lifts. He does this very effectively. Think Myra Hindley and Ian Brady. Think Carla Molka and Paul Bernardo, right? Think about couples who went out and procured victims because there was a female present. If there is a female present, even though it makes absolutely no sense when you actually logically explore it, that you are safer getting into a car with a female and a male, because we have evidence of individuals in the UK, for example, like Fred and Rose West, multiple serial killers who work together. The truth is, you don't feel as scared. If there is a young girl and a guy in a car and they're offering you a lift, you don't feel as scared. Believe it or not, when I was growing up, I used to hitchhike. When I was traveling, I used to hitchhike. Also, I used to pick people up in my camper van when I was actually driving around places like New Zealand and Australia. I genuinely thought I was safe. It's ludicrous that I had that mindset. It was a bias I needed to believe in at the time. It served a purpose. But sure, you get into a car with anyone or they get into your car, you're not necessarily in a safe place at all. You don't know who you are picking up. But he knows that most girls are going to be like, yeah, it's fine, there's a girl in there. So he gets them into the car, and then he makes his sister Gina get out of the car. And then that is when he starts being really inappropriate. He puts them in a position where they're alone with him and obviously, shall we say, makes inferences about what he'd like to do with them. And it always leads to those girls feeling trapped and uncomfortable. Now, when Anthony gets to around 21 years of age, he starts working as a telephone technician. Now, in one of those jobs, he actually installed the telephones at a bar, Ernie's on Banks, and he actually brought about the Tuesday night blues jams there. So it was a way of getting people together. So he is somebody that the locals see as a guy who's really friendly and helpful. He was good at his job. He was really excellent at getting on with everyone there. But bear in mind what I've said, when you are charismatic, you can wear it like a mask. It doesn't matter if you're dead behind the eyes. It doesn't matter if your soul is blacker than coal. It means that you can connect. When I think about charisma, I think about the X Factor. I think that's why Simon Cowell in the UK made billions, really, because what he did was note that certain individuals on this planet have this intoxicating way of communicating or singing or writing, and it is the X Factor, and you just want to be around them. Some people I've met in my life, and they're rare, but on occasion I've just felt like I would just love to stay around you. There is something so warm about you. That's what the X Factor is. Now, he hasn't got all the other traits that make him a good person. He's got the dark triad beneath this, which is narcissism, Machiavellianism, and also psychopathy. But nonetheless, at surface value, he can do it. And apparently, he'd really mastered how to be quite amicable in his adulthood. So he learned from those early teenage and childhood experiences, the rejection he felt, and he cultivated this capacity to be engaging and warm, and people liked him. He was able to put on that act. And people who actually knew Shaw, they started to affectionately call him Telephone Tony. So he's got a place, he's got a space. Life is good. He's a leech, he's a freak in many ways beneath the surface. But up until this point, he had a choice to be a good citizen, a law-abiding citizen, a person with a community of individuals who liked him. But of course, that would be if he didn't have the dark triad of personality traits lurking beneath the surface of that charisma. Now, in 1983, Anthony somehow manages to actually woo Gina Lynn Worley. He actually said that she was, on reflection, the absolute love of his life, and he did have 2 daughters with her, and they named them Amber and Tiffany. Now, it's interesting to me that he calls her the love of his life, because the thing about somebody like Shaw is he's not capable of love. I know that love is a spectrum. There is bad love, there is good love, of course. But when it comes down to true love on any level, even when the love is toxic, there is a real intensity and depth to it. This man will not have an intensity and depth to his nature, full stop. He's a user. He's an individual who will be somebody who sucks the life out of relationships. It's about him and him alone, and he will exploit everybody around him. But it may be that on reflection, when he thinks about Gina Lynn Worley, she for a period of time fulfilled that role. So it reflects that if she was the one I'd stayed with, she would have been the one that really enhanced my life because she was an amazing human being for this period of time. But what it actually means is she was the easiest that I had in my life to use. But she gives him 2 children. And again, he's now trying to live the archetypal American life where he's got a successful career, 2.4 children, and the wife who's looking after them. Like I said, it should have worked out well because he had everything in his pocket. But people like Shaw, they're greedy on a range of levels, and they're insatiable on certain levels. Now, on the 26th of September 1986, this is just when Anthony is 24 years old. And like I've told you guys, everything's going well for Telephone Tony. But really, all of that stuff, the family, the job, the community, none of it really interests him. What truly interests him is what lies beneath. It's the monster. So at 24 years of age, he takes his first victim. And that first victim is 14-year-old Laurie Tremblay. Now, Laurie Tremblay used to get the bus early to school every single day. She had her problems, but this girl would always be on time. She's trying her best. Now, I would say, as a 14-year-old child, which she was trying to look older. She was trying to play older, but she's a kid. Look back to when you were 14. Certainly, I can relate to that. I wanted people to think I was 18. I wanted to buy alcohol, cigarettes. I wanted to have boys like me who were a little bit older because I did not know that was a terrible attitude to have because I was a kid. That's the beauty of being a kid. You can play at those things and hopefully the world around you will be protective of you because you're not protecting yourself. And Laurie is in a situation where she's trying her best. She's attractive, she gains attention, but like I said, at her heart, she is a little girl trying to make sure that she gets to school every day on time. Now, Anthony Shaw knows Laurie. He used to see her every day pretty much at the bus stop, and he uses that charisma. He chats to her, and then cleverly, he begins occasionally giving her lifts to school in his car. Now, there's a particular day as he's building that grooming relationship with her, because that's what he's doing. Bear in mind, he's got time, he's got plans, he's got a violent fantasy without a doubt, but he's taking his time. Bear that in mind where serial killers are concerned. I've talked about this when I've done my national tour on the serial killer next door, and I absolutely mean it. When it comes down to particular serial killers, bear in mind those who are more on the organised spectrum. You, the victim, you are the last chapter. But they've been writing the book for years. So by the time they arrive at that action of murdering you, you bet your bottom dollar they want time. They want to play out the violent fantasies and they don't want to get caught because they want to repeat. So they don't mind taking a lot of time rehearsing and getting to that point. Now, on this particular day, when she gets in the car, they get into an argument. And you know why? Because this 14-year-old girl has had Anthony Shaw unhook her bra. She doesn't like it. She doesn't want it. She wants him to stop. And rightfully so. She's 14. This is a grown-ass man 10 years older than her. Now, she's rightfully arguing with her. She's saying this is not okay by me. So he just hits her head. And then once he's shocked her, he gets out a cotton cord. He pulls that cotton cord around her neck and he starts to strangle her with it. Now, the cotton cord is really thin. It keeps snapping. So bear in mind, this 14-year-old child who thinks she can trust this man, who has just dared to say no to something that she didn't wish for him to do to her, is now realising that this has been a plan. She has time to calculate, to recognise that her demise is coming at the hands of an individual she truly believed that she could trust. And he's using cord after cord, and then he hurts his finger whilst he's killing her because he's got his finger trapped in there. And those cord lines were left around Laurie's neck. Also, an impression of his knuckle was left on the back of her neck. Imagine how much time that must have taken for her to know that she was being murdered by a man that she trusted. Laurie's body was discovered behind the Mexican restaurant called Nympha's, and her murder literally went unsolved for many, many years. Anthony was not even suspected in the case. Telephone Tony? It would never be Telephone Tony. He actually said later that he had really tried to make sure that she would never, ever tell anybody. And ultimately, the way you can ensure that is to snuff the very life out of the individual that had the information that they believe could be used against you. Now, the second murder, well, that happens on April the 16th, 1992. This is when Maria del Carmen Estrada, she was 21 years of age at the time. She's picked up by Anthony, and she's picked up in the early morning hours. She's basically walking to her job as a nanny. Now, once she's in the car, because she's accepted a lift, bear in mind, this is a time period where people often hitchhiked, and she's probably happy to be able to get in the warmth. He again starts to make innuendos and sexual advances towards her whilst she's in the car. So she's trapped. But he then says at this point, when he is literally delivering these completely unwanted advances, he says she freaks out. Of course she freaks out, because you're a freak. Stay back. Don't come near me. You know, at the end of the day, she accepted a lift. She didn't accept that she was going to get involved in any sexual relationship with her. But instead of just accepting that she should be allowed out, he just rapes her brutally. He actually used a pair of shears to cut off her clothes. Imagine how terrified that poor girl was. Then once he's finished having his fun, assaulting her, he strangles her with a nylon cord, and he uses a piece of wood to tighten it, and that's how people can tighten the tourniquets. Now, a delivery driver ends up discovering that lovely girl's body behind a Houston Dairy Queen drive-thru. When they studied her body essentially to figure out what was obviously the reason for her death, understandably, they could see that she had had a tourniquet used to strangle her. And they could see that there was a great deal of trauma on her face. They noticed that different items of clothing had been torn or removed. And another thing that they recognised when they did the autopsy was she had a very deep contusion inside her vagina. So her death had been horrific. That was because she literally accepted a lift off a man that she believed was going to take her safely to work. Then we get to the 19th of October, 1993. Another 14-year-old. A girl called Salma Jansky. She's attacked by Anthony in her home. Now listen, This one ends slightly differently. We know with serial killers, a lot of them have a methodology. They will stalk a victim, or they'll have a victim profile. They'll lock in on that. So they'll figure out their movements, etc. And it's because they enjoy the fantasy. They enjoy working it through in their head what they're going to do. They enjoy finding out about what that person's life is like because they want to be equipped. And that's exactly what he's done with her. He's been watching her for a while. In fact, he's been completely infatuated with her, so totally on that stalking spectrum. And also, he'd figured out that she's usually at home by herself once school's finished. Now, unlike Anthony's previous victims, Selma survives the attack. Bear in mind, the name Selma is actually a pseudonym. She was 14. She has to be protected identity-wise. Now, on this attack, he wears gloves, sunglasses, and a bandana over his face. So clearly he doesn't want to be recognised. He wants to hide those features. Initially, he really calmly informs her that he's just going to rob the house. So he's trying to lure her into that false sense of security. It's all going to be okay. I'm just going to steal things from the house. It'll be over soon. Then he covers her eyes and her mouth with tape, which must be terrifying for her, ties her hands together with electrical cord, and then he goes ahead and uses a knife to cut off her underwear and he rapes her violently. Now, bear in mind, she's 14 years old. This is a grown man raping and sodomizing her, and she is screaming throughout the attack because she's in pain. Now, he was really annoyed by the fact that she was screaming. He said she was being too loud. Can you imagine the narcissism in that context and in that comment? To say to somebody that you are raping and violating, that she's being too loud. Not thinking at all about the reality of the impact on her. Just it's annoying to him because obviously it can draw attention to what he's doing. Now he starts to strangle her, but boy, this girl is not going down without a fight, and she fights and fights and fights and fights. She kicks him and kicks him and kicks him. She manages to break free from his grasp, and for whatever reason, before he leaves and doesn't go through with actually killing her, he says to her, I've been watching you. I know everything about you. I know where you go to school. I know that you play soccer. If you report me, I'm coming back. Now, Selma, of course, tells her parents, and she ends up having to go through an awful sexual assault examination, which is another violation. And they do discover semen in her body. And it's also found at this point that Selma's hymen and anus were torn because understandably she hadn't had sexual contact before. And that just shows you the violence of the attack. Now, the reason I believe that he didn't kill Selma was he liked to continue the trauma. He liked to continue the power. He's saying to her, I know where you live. I did it here, I did it this time, I can come back. So he must fully believe that he is still in control of her to some degree. And I don't think that's an empty threat. I think he'll be toying in his mind with the idea of, yeah, I could go back and do that to her. Now, he, on reflection, when he talked about that particular rape, said he felt he was able to beat the evilness in this case because he didn't murder her. And again, what does that tell you about the spectrum of acceptability where Shaw is concerned? He believes that rape without killing is moral. He doesn't realise that rape is clearly evil too. So he feels towards women that they are to be used for pleasure, even at a woman's displeasure. They are to be used without consent because their needs are not important. Now, Anthony and Gina separate because Gina, understandably, has a mind and a brain of her own and can see that there is something totally wrong with Anthony Shaw. But bizarrely, she allows Anthony Shaw to be given full custody of their two girls. Now, bear in mind, think about his predilection. Think about his attraction base. He likes young girls. And now his own two daughters have been handed over by their mother. And the reason that the mother didn't fight for custody was because she wanted to move in with a new boyfriend. I do judge women like that. I'm sorry. I appreciate men leave all the time. I get it. We don't give men anywhere near the same rap as we do women, and we should. Men who leave and aren't interested in their kids are the lowest of the low. Scum. Absolute scum. But for me, a woman who chooses to move in with a new boyfriend, giving her children a very clear message, which is I choose him over you, she's scum too. Simple as that. And those two girls are being left with a man of such intense and immense danger that it is unforgivable. We get to August the 7th, 1994, and this is why I feel such fear for his own children. Because Shaw sees 9-year-old Diana Ribolla. 9. I'm sure a lot of you have got 9-year-olds around. They're babies. All Diana had done was leave her home to buy some sugar for her mum. She lived 3 blocks away. She wasn't even wearing shoes. She was just walking like a naive, innocent child rightfully has the opportunity to walk, to go and do something nice for her mum, because that's what we believe the world's safe. But it wasn't for Diana. She never came back because Anthony Shaw saw her while she was walking. He's driving at that point. He pulls over, starts to talk to her. And of course, children are trusting. Why would a 9-year-old not feel that it was acceptable to talk to a man? In fact, we talk about stranger danger all the time, but we're not honest about it. You know, first of all, it's not strangers on the whole that attack children or kill children, it's people they know. But even on the level of stranger danger, we know that most children who are informed about don't talk to strangers don't feel they have a right to, because they're constantly scolded if they're not nice to people who are adults when they talk to them. So they get these mixed messages their entire life. Don't talk to a stranger. Then a stranger talks to them in a social place and they don't know that person and the kid ignores them. The parent's upset and says, don't be rude. There's just all these ridiculous mixed messages. So most kids, evidenced by research that we've done around this area, will just do what the adult tells them because you've been training them to be a good little person. We need to train children to be a lot more objectionable, let's be real. They shouldn't just be clones of one another, nodding their head in the right places. We need individuals who are independent and can say no. It's so powerfully important to find that voice. So of course, she's chatting away, and then when the opportunity arises, he kidnaps her. She's 9. Her last moments are being dragged into a van by this stranger. He uses duct tape to bind her hands and feet together, drives them out of sight behind the back of a building, then he rapes her. She's 9. He strangles her with a rope. He gets a piece of bamboo stick to tighten it. It took 12 hours before Diana's body was found behind an empty building. She was naked, other than a black top which had been pulled up above her breasts, and she had obvious blood around her vagina and her anus, and the rope in the bamboo stick was left around her neck. One of the neighbours in her neighbourhood actually did provide a lead. They said to the investigators, listen, I've seen a van, and I've seen a van that's often in this area, but it didn't get followed up. Nothing came from it, which is just astonishing to me. It caused a real cerebral and visceral and community reaction in so many people. This was a 9-year-old child, and we know that we've talked about 14-year-old children. Of course, their lives are of equal meaning. A 21-year-old person, of course, her life is of equal meaning, but there is just something so abandoning when it comes down to the murder of a 9-year-old child. A homicide investigator, Bob King, he actually got involved in the case, and he said it literally haunted him. He could never, ever let go of Diana's case. In fact, he kept a picture of that beautiful little girl at his desk, and her unsolved murder haunted him every day. In fact, this is a quote, and I think it's a beautiful and telling quote about this man. He said, she was just a little barefoot kid going to the store to get some sugar so her mum could make some lemonade. 3 blocks there and 3 blocks back. And he's so right. He's so right. This belief that it's just a short distance, and at 9 years old, of course you can go to the shop, and it's just such an obvious reality that you go there, you get your sugar, you go home, everything's fine, you get your lemonade. But no, because on this occasion, that beautiful little girl was intercepted by this monster. And there are so many people who relate to that. I know James Bulger's mum, and I have just the most intense respect for her. James Bulger was murdered by John Venables and Robert Thompson in the UK many years ago now, but it feels very, very present. But like in that moment, at the end of the day, she was just buying something, James was there, and then he was gone. Just disappeared. Because these predators of all ages, they exist, and it's horrifying. And the murders don't end there. And this man is still on the loose, which is just blindside him. Because that means on the 6th of July 1995, Anthony Shaw has spotted 16-year-old Dana Sanchez. She'd basically been using a payphone, and he said that she seemed to have been really angry. So that's his excuse for going over to actually have a conversation. He offers her a lift. She agrees to it. At the time, she was just walking to her boyfriend's house. Immediately, as soon as she gets in, he starts touching her inappropriately. Now, she is resisting. She says, I've got a boyfriend. I've just told you I've got a boyfriend. He then drags her unceremoniously into the back of the van, takes her clothes off. She fights. She bites him on the chest. At this point, he restrains her and he murders her again by strangulation using a rope. But he didn't actually rape her. He then leaves her body in a field in Northview Park. Now, when a week had gone by, Dana's body still hadn't been discovered. And that's annoying for Anthony Shaw. Because the thing about these kind of killers is they're really not satisfied if people aren't realising their work. He's killed, he's dumped a body, no one's talking about it. And that means that nobody might find her body. So he doesn't like that. He calls CPRC-TV. It's a local radio station in Houston. He calls them anonymously and he says, listen, there's a serial killer on the loose. And he tells them exactly where they can find Dana's body. And of course, they go out of curiosity and they do discover that she's there. She's in a state of decomposition. But again, she's got a yellow rope with a toothbrush tied around her neck. That toothbrush having been used as the rod to tighten the tourniquet. Is it just me, guys? Is it just me that in this area, there have been these murders at different points, but one of the commonalities is the way that they've been murdered, right? It's a signature. It's a pattern. You can actually connect. And I know that many of you will think that a signature is something that's physical, such as the Zodiac Killer leaving his calling card, BTK, those kind of things where you can physically see it, Richard Ramirez with the pentagram. But that's not the way that signatures have to work. It doesn't have to be that calling card. It can be a pattern. In fact, part of a signature is the type of victim you go for. So if it's a series of children being killed, they're the people disappearing, that's a connector. And in this case, the fact that they're being killed with a tourniquet and they're leaving things like bamboo sticks and toothbrushes so you can evidence how the death is occurring, surely somebody is thinking to themselves, this is a link. Also, you've literally had somebody call in and say a serial killer's on the loose, and indeed they found a body. Now, in the winter of 1995, Anthony's sister Gina, she decides that she's going to go and stay with her brothers and nieces. Go have a visit, see how things are. Now, bear in mind, Gina's memory of Anthony Shaw is he hangs socks up. He educates people on how to keep in an ordered situation. Yes, you might use a screwdriver on your head as well, but for the most part, he's a very tidy individual. Not so anymore, shall we say. She is absolutely blindsided when she arrives at the place because the conditions in which he and the children are living are deplorable. So the house is just absolutely infested with cockroaches. It's obviously very, very dirty. There was really very limited food in the house at all. And that was obviously something that really stood out because she was expecting cleanliness. There were ants everywhere in the food. So even stuff that was there, it wasn't going to be edible. And she really hadn't been expecting that. Anthony had been meticulously clean in the past. Also, she noticed that the windows were all nailed shut. Does that speak of paranoia? Does that speak of somebody not wanting the outside world looking in? Also, she's told by people who know Anthony Shaw that the daughters are often locked in the house. And Gina, because she's a good human being and a decent person, she's so disturbed by this. And she's so worried about the health and well-being of her nieces that she makes a report to Child Protective Services. Now, for people who are struggling to understand how an individual can go from being hyper clean to this kind of horror in a home, what people often don't realise is that when I referred to OCD earlier on, and obviously I can't diagnose him with OCD, but I've worked with many people with OCD, and people tend to think that OCD is ritualistic. So it will be washing hands, it will be being afraid of germs, it will be cleaning the house constantly, locking doors, opening doors, locking doors, opening doors, turning on lights, etc., turning them off, that kind of mindset. Now, I think that's a very stereotypical understanding, and that's because when people put it in films, etc., it tends to be that kind of portrayal. But there is a whole spectrum to OCD, and part of that spectrum, for example, is hoarding disorder, where people just can't let go of anything. They'll store their own feces and urine in literal Tupperware, and it will pile up to the roofs in their houses. They'll have food from 20 years ago. They'll be infested by everything. There is a connection and an attachment that's so psychologically profound that they can't let things go. So just because a house is absolutely horrific when you look at it cleanliness wise, that does not mean there is not a psychological reasoning behind it. Because like I said, it's just that often when we talk about OCD, we do these very stereotypical ones that you see in the press or on TV shows where people go to houses and are dealing with people who are struggling with germs, etc. With respect, it's such a big spectrum, and part of that, like I said, is where people don't throw things out. So it could be that he's just moved to a different area of the spectrum of OCD. But she goes ahead and actually reports to Child Protective Services, and rightly so. She's very concerned. But, of course, Child Protective Services pop out and say, the girls are safe with the father. No action was taken. Now, I don't know about you. I'm not imagining they got in the house. Because if they did get in the house, and I was like, do you know that there are cockroaches literally everywhere? Yeah. Do you know that there are literally ants in the food? The only food in the house. And I'm pretty sure some of that food is 2 years old. Oh, yeah. We like ants. Right. And the windows are kind of nailed shut in a kind of horror-esque movie type way. Yes, I don't like light. Right. Do you think you're an appropriate father? Yeah, I think I'm great. Absolutely great. No one's getting in. The ants are really quite interesting to watch, and cockroaches can survive a nuclear fallout. So when you think about it, I'm actually really protecting my children. Do you know what? You're right. I'll just write that you're a great dad. But genuinely, if they had got in the house, I can't imagine it would go like that. But he's really persuasive. He's really charismatic. If he just had a conversation with them, he's just going to convince CPS that Gina's a horrible cow and he's a great dad. Look at me. I'm a single father. Do you even know another single father? Well, no, we don't, because most of the kids are placed with the mothers. Right, but I'm a single father with 2 children. I'm telephone Tony at the end of the day. Yes, I have to make my windows nailed shut, but that's because I care deeply. I don't want them to be attacked or taken by anybody. And what about the food? Oh, well, I know that the food looks bad, but really we just eat fresh, non-processed and leave all the old food for the rats and the ants and the cockroaches, because I'm a single dad. And I like to think about the animals needing help too, because I'm a single dad, and we're really good because we stay when the woman went. I believe that something like that would have happened. Genuinely, women were the ones left with the kids. So CPS probably are like, this guy is just a great guy because he's kept the kids, even though they're living in deplorable conditions. It's as simple as that. But he manages to get away with this. Now, Tiffany, who is one of his daughters, who was living in this state and was also having the worst time of her life, she would later talk about just how grotesque it was living there. She said that her and her sister would have to share bath water. Now, I know that a lot of you will be like, well, I did too. It's just a time thing, innit? We didn't have central heating. It was just one tank that heated up. You had that much water. You, your brother and your sister were all in there. It was not a pleasant experience. Don't know about you guys. I still don't like baths because of that trauma response. But also they used to have to use toilet paper on a limited level to save money. And those girls were going to school and they were dirty and they smelled terrible and they were bullied because of that. So they had a hellish time, full stop. And Anthony Shaw was considered an incredibly controlling father. He was very abusive. He'd hit them. He even picked them up by the hair. If they dared to cry, he'd tell them that if you don't stop, I'm going to smother you with a pillow. And this guy would have. Let's bear that in mind. This guy has killed before. Now we get to 1997. Thank God Anthony's children escape. They get to go to California to live with their grandmother. Now, that's his mother, but thank God they're not in those deplorable situations. Now, the reason that they are sent to grandmother is not for their benefit, by the way. It's not as if Anthony Shaw said, "Oh, I've realised the error of my ways. Serving pasta with ants is probably not the way forward." No. He had basically done exactly what their mother had done. He'd met somebody, decided he was going to marry them, and he didn't want the kids there anymore. So Amy Lynch is the person who is unlucky enough to have met him. He wanted to have a honeymoon. He wanted to be free. So she's also considerably younger than him, by the way. So Amy Lynch is 18 years of age when she is with him. He's 33 years of age. So he's got a lot of life experience on his hands. Also, we know he's a predator. We know he's an abuser. She is walking into the den of vipers. Now, whilst away from home, Tiffany actually starts to talk to her auntie, who's obviously lovely. You know, there's obviously been some real concern about the girls by Gina. And she says, "My dad's been sexually abusing me. And this has been happening since I was in kindergarten." Also, because of that conversation, they speak to Amber, her sister, and it turns out the same has been happening to her too. And what is amazing about that aunt is she 100% believed her. And those crimes were reported. Both of Anthony's children testified against him. They said that he used to stand naked in the doorway of the bedroom and he used to touch himself and masturbate. He'd also molested each of the girls, both Amber and Tiffany. As I noted, this was when Amber was in kindergarten, so just conceive of the kind of monster we're talking about. And the girls had created these defense mechanisms where they hoped that he wouldn't come near. They pretended they were asleep, but he would just carry on touching them inappropriately. He'd touch them on the breast, the vagina, the anus. Tiffany had actually become so helpless, so hopeless, so depressed about what was happening that she didn't want to be here. She became utterly suicidal. And Anthony was actually informed by Amber that this was the case, that her sister doesn't want to be here because of what's happening. And he said, if she isn't successful in killing herself, the girls are going to be taken away and put into terrible and separate foster homes. So as opposed to hearing the pain and acknowledging his part, he was like, yeah, if she doesn't do it successfully, you're just going to be sent away to an even worse situation. Now, when it came down to those charges, Anthony did plead no contest to 2 charges of indecency with a child. Now, at this point, should we not just throw him in prison, lock him away, and lose the key? Is that a possibility? But no, apparently not. Because in October 1997, he's charged with child molestation and he doesn't spend a second in prison. Not a second. Unbelievably, these kind of things are happening in the UK all the time. But in 1997, I would have expected more because actually people did go to prison for child molestation. But instead, he's offered this bizarre plea bargain, and this means he's free. All he has to do is provide a DNA sample and register as a sex offender. So at this point, Anthony's DNA sample was entered into a data bank. And this is obviously going to become vital in connecting him to his heinous crimes. Now, what kind of makes me smile in this moment is when he was offered that plea deal, he's thinking to himself, ha, got away with it again. At the end of the day, I can molest and abuse my own children and I'm not even going to go to prison. So of course, when he agrees to that DNA sample, he's doing it because it works for him. Little does he know, he's a dead man walking. We get to 1999, Anthony and Amy divorce because Amy's realised he's a massive abuser and she's not going to put up with it anymore. She even said he tried to kill her. And in an interview later down the line, she said, "Tony once told me he was going to make me famous. I thought it would be because of our music. I didn't think it would be because I'd married an evil man." Yeah, when he said that to her, he was probably meaning, I'll kill you, you'll get famous that way. Now in 2003, the crime lab in Houston was actually forced to close. So obviously what we know in the States is that there are different forensic labs and there's been a lot of controversies around the world, in the Western world, regarding how certain data is kept, how certain items are contaminated, and therefore how certain crimes have been seen as unsafe, or indeed certain criminals have got away with it because things weren't done appropriately. So there is an audit at the crime lab in Houston, and they find a ton of issues, including the fact that data, for example, have been misinterpreted or misreported, which is harrowing when you're thinking about crime. Also, they discovered that a lot of the technicians just weren't trained, and there was a lack of competent reviews. So as a result of that, samples from some cases end up getting sent to the labs in Dallas. Now, one of those samples was fingernail clippings from Maria. Because Maria, when he had killed her, she'd fought back against her attacker and had DNA evidence under her nails. Almost 12 years after her murder, there was a match. There was a match to the DNA found on Maria's body. And that match was confirmed to be the DNA of Anthony Shaw. And that DNA of Anthony Shaw was only on the system due to his conviction for the abuse of his daughters. What a beautiful, beautiful connection. He got away with it as far as he was concerned. And all the while, his daughters were sealing his fate, and rightly so. Now, the Houston Police Department Homicide Captain Richard Holland said this. He said, "The technology at the time in 1992 was not what it was today. Advancement in the field of DNA analysis allows labs to do more with less evidence. But if he hadn't been charged with molesting his daughters, it's likely that Anthony would have gone unpunished for many more years, and young girls could easily have been attacked more." We get to the 24th of October 2003. At this point, finally, Anthony Shaw's arrested for the rape and murder of Maria. When he was questioned by the police, he suddenly decided it was time to confess to the other murders which he committed, as well as the rape of the other victim, Selma. And apparently when he admitted this, he was really calm. He was incredibly unemotional. He was obviously somebody who had given information that the police didn't have, and that's helpful, but essentially he's compounding his own potential sentence by admitting this. Now, the police, they hadn't actually connected Laurie, his first victim's death, to the other three due to the fact that in that murder he hadn't used a tourniquet. But as we know, the MO, it's learned dynamic behaviour. The modus operandi isn't always consistent. It tends to go for a particular type of kill, like strangulation, but they get better at it. So initially, he uses that cord that was breaking, it was causing a trouble, he hurt his finger, so he learns to use the tourniquet. But it should not have not been connected simply because it didn't have the tourniquet. They should have looked at the way the person was killed, which essentially was choked to death, because that's in context. Now, he actually told the police that in the process of killing Laurie, he'd injured his finger trying to strangle her, so that's why he'd use a tourniquet in his future attacks. He wanted to prevent that happening again. He also said he'd attempted to remove her bra and said he hadn't actually sexually assaulted Laurie. So without that particular admission, he may never have actually been linked to her death. What he did manage to do, though, with the investigators is readily provide lots of information. So when he talked about Maria, he said he didn't actually set out to kill her. He said that wasn't my intention, but it got out of hand. It didn't get out of hand, did it, Shaw? It didn't get out of hand. You know, for example, I get into arguments very rarely. But when I do get into arguments, there have on occasion been times where I can reflect and think, oh, that got a little bit out of hand. You know, maybe I raised my voice. Maybe I used the odd expletive to express my feeling. Got a little bit out of hand, a little bit OTT, a little bit regrettable. I don't think, yeah, when I was having an argument with Pete, then I shot him in the head. That's not out of hand. He murdered her, but we know these killers minimise. Minimisation is absolutely connected to every single serial killer I have ever studied. They all minimise. He also said the classic lines that we hear time and time again from serial killers, that he wanted to have her and to possess her in some way. I mean, there's a whole heap of not-rights who believe that. Samuel Little killed a ton of women, and actually disrespected them further by sketching them very badly so that the police could try and identify them. The Green River Killer, a ton of women. They all say the same things, that at some point in the future, they're going to meet them. They're going to belong to them. I know, of course, at some point they will meet them, but that will only be while all the group of those individuals decide what kind of punishment they're going to receive in hell during their eternal afterlife. I have some good ideas. If any of those girls would like to contact me in any way, shape or form, you just come and we'll have a conversation about some of the inventions that I've literally created in my head. Not long ago, I remember in my head creating a penis guillotine, and that's mild. That's a mild suggestion. Now, Anthony's murder trial finally begins in October 2004. The prosecutor was Kelly Siegler. Now, when it came down to his charges, he was actually only charged with the murder of Maria. And the reason for that was it's a slam dunk case. There was forensic evidence linking him to the attack. He admitted the attack, but with the others, there was a potential of reasonable doubt, so they didn't want the defence to be able to play that card. There wasn't DNA evidence connecting him to those crimes. During the case, Kelly Siegler for the prosecution said that evil lives amongst us. And sometimes evil, as the evidence will show, comes in the form of someone who looks completely normal. And I completely compute that. I completely connect with that. Because we have this idea, don't we, that if it looks okay, it must be okay. It's absolute BS. But it's because we have to make these split-second decisions in our lives. And if somebody's smiling nicely or somebody's chatting nicely, you just want to believe that that's because they're a good person. You don't for a minute sit there and think maybe they are actually a predator and they're trying to lure me into a false sense of security. And actually, that's what predators do. But we can't live like that. We have to believe that for the most part, people are good. And for the most part, that works for us. But then there are certain situations where it literally seals our fate. Now, when it came down to the case itself, the prosecution had an absolute watertight case. The evidence against Anthony spoke for itself, and he was indeed found guilty of capital murder. Now, in his sentencing hearing, which took place on the 21st of October 2004, Anthony Shaw actually told his attorneys, I don't want to have any mitigation evidence presented. I don't want you to introduce anything that gives me an excuse. What I want to do is I want to accept the death penalty. I want to accept that's being pursued. I want to say that's what I want. I don't want a life sentence. Just go ahead and agree death. Now, during the sentencing phase, the jury were actually informed that Anthony was actually a serial killer and that he'd further confessed to 3 other murders in addition to Maria, and in addition to the rape of Selma. Now, they were also told about the fact that he'd molested his own young daughters. So, you know, just throwing it out there. This is a death sentence case. Yes, we know, and it's very important that we consider the fact it is. How are you feeling about them right now? Well, he has done a horrendous thing. He's murdered this poor, innocent woman. And I definitely think he deserves a life sentence. He doesn't want a life sentence, he wants a death sentence. I know, but I'm not sure I want to put somebody to death, if that makes sense. And so John and Alan here, they're not convinced either. Well, that's interesting. Is it because you're against the death penalty? It's because a lot of people have done horrible things like this, but they don't necessarily get the death sentence. It's just I've got some additional notes for you. Would you like the additional notes? Oh, of course I'd like the additional notes. I'm not sure it will change my mind, but go ahead. Well, he's responsible for several more murders. He's a serial killer and he molested his own children. Sorry, you've gone quiet. What's that you're doing? Oh, you're drawing a hangman. Right. You, Alan and John are all in agreement then. Right, great. We'll just crack on with the death sentence, yeah. No, you can't carry it out. Just stay in your seats. But you know what I mean? You can imagine how the jury would be. Now, Selma herself came and testified at the sentencing hearing. Bear in mind, she was the only victim who actually survived, and she confirmed that Anthony Shaw had been the person who attacked and raped her. Also asked the court to give him the death penalty for his crimes. Go, Selma. We are all behind you. I know people have got issues with the death penalty, but when you can give it, if anybody fits the crime, this guy does. He's bang to right. Simple as that. Now, former girlfriends of Anthony Shaw and his wife also testified. They said that he drugged them, he raped them, he choked them while having sex, that he had pornography of young girls. We would refer to that now as child sexual exploitation material as opposed to child porn. The clinical director of a sex offenders program literally described Anthony as having superior intellect and abstract reasoning abilities. Yes, abstract reasoning abilities meaning can kill without conscience. He also said he was grandiose, opportunistic, manipulative and narcissistic, so a whole heap of horrible. Anthony also scored very highly on a measure of psychopathy, and though he was aware of what was socially acceptable behaviour, he knew that in spite of being able to tell right from wrong, he had this mindset where if he could break the law and get away with it, he absolutely would. So he knew what right was, he knew what wrong was, he knew how to act morally, he just chose, if he believed he could get away with it, not to do so. Now, the jury actually went ahead and recommended the death sentence. The decision took them less than an hour. Literally less than an hour. Let's all say aye, aye. Now, despite asking for the death sentence himself, Anthony Shaw would actually later try to appeal his sentence on multiple occasions. You think you want it, kid, and then you get it, and then all of a sudden you're like, I'm a narcissist, I don't really want to die. Anyway, every single one of those were indeed denied, and rightfully so. Now, Anthony Shaw was initially set to be executed on October the 18th, 2017, so very recent, but it ends up getting rescheduled just hours before. This is because the district attorney asked for further time to investigate rumours that he was going to confess to another murder, which is important because there are families out there who have lost their loved ones and don't know how. There are families out there who have lost loved ones and no one's been brought to justice. So when somebody says with form, I did it, then it's really imperative that they get answers. So at this point, he's granted a stay of execution, and he was actually planning to admit to a murder of Melissa Trotter. Now, actually, a fellow inmate, Larry Swearingen, he was the person who had been indicted, charged and found guilty of Melissa Trotter's murder, and he was set to be executed for that. Now, investigators were 100% sure that Larry had committed the murder, but Shaw admitting the guilt would obviously leave a cloud over the judicial proceedings in Swearingen's case. Now, it turns out that Anthony Shaw later confessed he hadn't committed the murder. He was just friends with Larry, and he thought, well, I'm going to die, may as well die, taking the blame from a friend. But he also added that he genuinely thought that Larry was actually innocent. So we could say that maybe on a moral compass level, as far as Anthony Shaw is concerned, maybe there was a tiny glimmer of conscience when it came down to the long-term relationships that he had with people incarcerated. Now, some of Anthony Shaw's family said that they did believe he'd killed more people than he admitted to. His sister Gina absolutely does. She says there have to have been other girls. She said, I know in my heart without a doubt there are more. In the end, Anthony's execution was rescheduled for early 2018. And finally, on the 18th of January 2018, Anthony Shaw was executed by lethal injection at 55 years of age. In his final statement, he said this: no amount of words or apology could ever undo what I've done. To the families of my victims, I wish I could undo the past, but it is what it is. You know, when it comes down to a statement, bear in mind, imagine this. You are there as a member of the family who have lost somebody of intense, incalculable meaning. You've waited decades. People you loved have died who loved that person who was lost, and they've never got to see anybody brought to justice. And you're just waiting to hear the words of the killer. And you kind of know there's not going to be a lot of depth potentially. But in the past, I have read statements from people who were actually put to death. And some of them don't heal, don't bring closure. But with some statements, you do read them and you think, this person has found some kind of grounding in a reality of what they did. The words are not empty. They're not like shells. They actually have meaning, and it doesn't change what happened at all. But the culpability and accountability and responsibility that they take is profound and important. And the way that they speak about their actions is all about it being on them. And of course, they can't bring those people back, but you just get this sense that that person's conscience has grown and that they have felt some kind of emotional pain in the reflection and recognition of what they did to other people. And like I say, it doesn't change it. It doesn't give comfort to the family. They're still dealing with the loss, but it makes you feel like they will have had some kind of emotional agony in coming to terms with what they did. But to say, sorry, can't do anything about it though, can we? Let's move on. It's just pathetic. And the apology is very, very shallow as far as I'm concerned, because of course he wishes he hadn't done it because he's now going to be put to death, but he's not thinking about actually what he did, why he did it, and the impact that that's had. Now, apparently it was apologetic in tone, his voice cracked when he spoke, but I'm sorry, he's facing imminent death, so of course he's going to be feeling that way. And do you know why I find it very shallow, what he said? It's because he added that he will die with a clear conscience. I made my peace. I'm sorry. Yeah, I am dying with a clear conscience. I've made my peace. Who with? With, you know, who I need to make peace with. With who? With who have you made peace? Well, you know, the big G-O-D. The very judgmental big G-O-D. The forgiving G-O-D. No, the one who makes you go through Judgment Day. The one who decides, you know, whether good or bad people can arrive in the place and space that most of us wish to arrive. You know, when he said it was harder to get a camel through an eye of a needle than to let a sinner go through the gates of heaven. I'm just imagining that when it comes down to you and a needle, the camel that's got a struggle to get through, imagine a hairy mammoth. Imagine one of the largest dinosaurs and that same needle. You're even bigger of a problem to the big G-O-D. So you may have made peace, but he's going to be like, that's cool, I'm glad you made peace, and you can now spend eternity in the fiery pits of hell, finding your loins burning at a temperature that you couldn't even begin to imagine. Imagine when you see those places where people are welding stuff. That's cold compared to where you're going, sweetheart. So, off you pop with your peace. Sorry, wanting a little bit of a detraction there, but I cannot get my head around how dare he thinks he's going to die with a clear conscience. How can you die with a clear conscience? You murdered children. When they injected him, he said, ooh-wee, I can feel that. In my head, that's because somebody's hit him with a mallet at the same time, but that didn't happen either. This is when the injection's administered, because it's quite a protracted process, the death by lethal injection. He gets pronounced dead 13 minutes later. 13! Unlucky for some, unlucky for him without a doubt. Now, after his execution, a crime victim's advocate said to the crowd waiting outside, Anthony Allen Shaw's reign of terror is officially over. I wish they'd added, and his new residence in the fiery pits of hell is just beginning. Because believe me, the only neighbours he's going to have from now on are fellow serial killers who are burning just as brightly as he. Let me know your thoughts on this one. I know that some of you will be aware of this particular Tourniquet Killer. I know that some of you won't. If you have watched a video on this before, I hope I've given you some added value. Obviously, our thoughts are always with the victims. And like I said, I know that some of you find it really challenging when I cover a death penalty case, but boy, anyone deserved it. This creep did. This absolute murdering POS did. See you again next time, guys. Take care.